Secretary-General, thank you for talking to our new programme, Planet SOS. May I start with looking at the state of the world? The war in Syria, now in its 9th year, well over 500,000 people dead. The situation in Yemen, also very, very bad, the worst humanitarian crisis on earth. The war in Libya, reignited in recent months, and we've got unresolved conflicts all around the world. Somalia, Afghanistan, Central African Republic. When you look at that picture, why are you concentrating so much on climate that some might say is not such an immediate problem?
Well, first of all, let me congratulate Al Jazeera to launch a climate show regularly. I think it's a very good contribution to help people around the world know about the challenges of climate change. Now, we don't neglect all these conflicts. On the contrary, I mean, they occupy probably the overwhelming majority of our time and of our initiatives. There is a constant diplomacy for peace, even if the circumstances, as you know, are not easy. And we face many obstacles to make sure that we are able to prevent conflicts and to timely solve the conflicts we still have. But we need to recognize that the threat of each of these conflicts is to a certain extent localized, and climate change became a global threat for humankind and a global threat for the planet. And things are evolving in such a way that climate change became an accelerator of conflict. If you look at the Sahel is probably today the most complex environment in relation to conflict and terrorism in an area that is expanding. It started with Mali, now it impacts Burkina Faso and Niger, and it threatens to come to the countries of the coast that recently ECOWAS met, as you know, and decided to put their standby force also in support of the operations against terrorism in the area. It is clear that climate change, making desertification progress, making herders more and more difficult and moving south to communities where farmers are, creating more conflicts. Climate change is becoming an accelerating factor of many of the conflicts in the world. Some people even say, for instance, that one of the factors that contributed to the Arab Spring was the level of drought in some of those countries. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that it's climate change that is causing all the conflicts around the world, but it is clear that climate change is in itself a threat to us all, and at the same time is one of the accelerating factors of conflict.
When world leaders gather here in New York, you have convened a climate summit. You said to those world leaders, don't come with a speech, come with a plan. What do you want to hear?
Now, it's very simple. We are losing the race. Climate change is running faster than what we are. Things are getting worse by the day. We see natural disasters becoming more and more intense, more frequent, with more devastating consequences. I just came from the Bahamas, where I could witness the dramatic devastation of Hurricane Dorian. On the other hand, you look at the last month of July, it was the hottest month on record. We will have from 2015 to 2019 the 5 hottest years on record. And at the same time, we see glaciers melting. We see, for instance, the ice cap of Greenland has lost in July 297 billion tons of ice. So melting into the ocean. So you see that the rising waters in the oceans, the increase of temperatures, the multiplication of natural disasters, the dramatic impacts of drought in different parts of the world, all this is creating a situation that is a real threat to humankind, and we are not doing enough. What was decided in Paris was very important. The Paris Agreement is a fundamental pillar to defeat climate change. But the targets that were fixed and that later the scientific community, through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has clarified that we need to maintain the growth of temperature below the level of 1.5 degrees at the end of the century. And for that, we need to be carbon neutral in 2050. And we need to have a very meaningful reduction of about 45% of emissions in 2030. And for that, what was promised in Paris is not enough. And what was promised in Paris is not enough. And countries are supposed in 2020 to renew their engagements, the so-called national determined contributions. This summit is exactly to ask countries to make sure that they renew their engagements, increasing ambition, which means tough decisions that need to be taken in relation to fossil fuels, tough decisions that need to be taken in relation to the transformation of the way we produce food, we power our economies, we generate energy, we support mobility. So all this requires a very strong political will in order to be able to stop this dramatic race in which climate change is winning.
What do you do, though, about those countries? I'll call them the difficult customers. Countries like Australia, like Brazil, like the US that pulled out of the Paris climate deal. How do you persuade them?
Well, we are doing our best to persuade countries, but especially this is also a summit to address the public opinions in general. Governments will do largely, in the end, what public opinions tell them to do. Even in countries where governments are reluctant to act in relation to climate change, we see fantastic movements in the civil society, in the business community, in cities, in regions. And this summit is also an opportunity for those entities to come, to present their plans, and to tell governments that they also need to act. Because, as I said, this is now a global threat. That is a threat to the planet, but it's a threat for all of us.
But among the public opinion, there are the deniers. There are those that say the science isn't settled, that scientists disagree. There are those that say in history the temperature has gone up in the past and it's come back down. What do you say to people like that?
There are always denials in relation to every truth that exists in the world. But what we see, and if you follow polls around the world, you'll see that the number of people denying it is diminishing very quickly, and the number of people considering that climate change is the defining issue of our time, is the biggest threat that we face, is increasing very rapidly, and more public opinions and even electorates are giving a very strong signal to governments that they need to consider climate change a real priority.
But it's some of the people who deny this. Let me read you a quote. "I'm not denying climate change, but it could well go back." That quote was from the end of last year. It was said by President Donald Trump. What do you say to him?
I'm saying that science is now clear. And the best available science that we have in the world is telling us, without any doubt, that climate change is the biggest threat that our communities face in the United States and around the world.
You seem very keen not to directly criticise President Trump.
And
he's wrong on this, isn't he? And he's the most powerful man on earth. You were at the G7 summit. He skipped the session of climate. And afterwards, let me just tell you what he said to the reporters who were there. "We are the #1 energy producer in the world, and I'm not going to lose that wealth. I'm not going to lose it on dreams on windmills, which frankly aren't working too well." Dreams and windmills. You need to confront that, don't you?
The truth is, and it's very simple, today renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy. And even in the United States, renewable energy is creating much more jobs than the production of energy by coal or oil. And so it is clear that the windmills of different sorts, solar, wind, other forms of renewable, are the future. And I'm absolutely sure that this will be recognized fully by the American society.
Moving from the US to China, the other big emitter, they are involved in this massive Belt and Road infrastructure project, the biggest project of its type on Earth. Are you worried that that's not going to be environmentally friendly?
Now, I was in Beijing recently, and I was asked to speak about the need to green the Belt and Road. We are concerned with the fact that coal, namely in Asia, is still a very important component in relation to the production of energy, and more than that there are a number of coal power plants in preparation for the future. And they have been supported in different Asian countries, and namely supported by countries like China, Japan or Korea. And our pressure, I was in Tokyo, I've been in Beijing, has been very clearly to say that it's time to consider that new coal power plants should not be built, and progressively in the future we should be phasing out coal.
If I may, there is a criticism of you, and it was made of your predecessor as well, which is that you are not prepared to stand up to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council on this issue, which you say is so crucial. Are you prepared to confront them even if it costs you a second term as Secretary General?
I don't care about a second term. I care about doing the right thing. If there is someone that has been very clear in relation to climate change, if there is someone that has been telling everybody that this is the fundamental battle of our time and that we really need to change course, I think I'm at ease in this regard. And so with the United States or China, with Russia or whoever, I've been telling all of them that they need to do everything in order to make sure that we reach carbon neutrality in 2050 and that temperatures will not grow above 1.5 degrees at the end of the century. And that means dramatic choices in relation to energy, coal, for instance, and in relation to all other aspects.
Before you were an international diplomat, and now the top international diplomat, you were a politician, a socialist politician. Can I ask you where you think the root of the problem with climate change comes from? And is part of it the focus on the markets and unbridled capitalism?
You know, I'm very proud of what I did in Portugal as Prime Minister. You probably see, if you look at statistics today, that Portugal has a high percentage of energy produced by renewables. And this was done through legislation that we introduced 20 years ago, in which the grid was forced to buy, at the time with a subsidized price. Today it's no longer necessary because the renewable energy is cheaper. But at the time, the grid was forced to buy any production of renewable energy, and this has boosted enormously the investment in renewables in Portugal. So what I did as Prime Minister is what I'm asking all governments in the world to do, is to take the adequate measures in regulations, in support, without needing any more to do subsidies to renewables. What they need is to cut the subsidies that go on being given to fossil fuels. It doesn't make any sense that taxpayers' money, my money as a taxpayer, can go to boost hurricanes or to bleach corals or to melt glaciers through the subsidizing of fossil fuels that today are no longer able to compete with renewables because renewables became the cheapest way to produce electricity.
So in some of those other countries, unlike Portugal, was there too much of a focus on the free market and capitalism without thinking about the effects on the planet?
It's not only a question of free market and capitalism, it's a question of wrong choices. Wrong choices made by the government and wrong choices made by the markets. And what the markets are also now showing is that indeed the future is in renewables. Look at the number of asset managers. Asset managers representing $34 trillion have said to the leaders of G20, time to change course, time to have climate action as a priority. You see, for instance, even if the sovereign fund of Norway is largely generated by the production of oil in Norway, you see that the sovereign fund of Norway now is divesting from fossil fuels based on a decision of the Norwegian Parliament. And you see coalitions of banks, coalitions of pension funds and other entities that decided to have now climate as a key element in the way they do business. And you see central banks drawing the attention for the risks of climate when they do economic calculations. So even markets are today recognizing that they need to incorporate carbon as a cost.
We've talked about countries, and the United Nations is an organization built on countries, member states. But let's talk about individuals. What should they be doing? Because the jargon is confusing, the science is confusing. Should ordinary people be giving up beef? Should they give up flying? I mean, I fly a lot, you fly a lot, as befits a Secretary General, you fly first class. What should ordinary individuals do?
I think we need also to look into our own footprint. And I believe there that we are having a fantastic lesson from the youth. The youth, as yesterday, had their own summit here in the United Nations. They had their own march. And the youth is telling their parents that we also need to change many of the aspects of our daily life. I'll give you an example. You have here a glass of water. Single-use plastics have been abolished in the UN headquarters. And they need to be abolished everywhere in the world. So we all need to change our habits. It's very practical to have a small bottle of plastic for the water, but we need to abolish them because they are undermining the health of our oceans and the health of our people. So again, in climate change, as in pollution in all aspects, we also need to recognize our contribution, and we need to think strongly about what we need to change in our lives.
You've spoken about the youth. These protests we've seen, Greta Thunberg we've seen outside the United Nations leading these school strikes. Do you think it's time for you as Secretary General to use this moment and perhaps use social media to reach above the member states and communicate directly with the people?
Well, I'm trying to do it myself. And to be clear, this summit was preceded, as you have seen, by a youth summit, exactly because we believe that today public opinions are more ready to accept the need to change than politicians themselves, and that it is very important that public opinions push their governments, push their political systems to take the right decisions.
Let's take stock of exactly where we are with the science. I mean, you're not a scientist, but in your job you're briefed by the very best scientists in the world. Even if we manage to turn things around, what damage has already been done to the Earth in terms of lost species, for example?
Now, we see biodiversity is one of the most dramatic aspects of today's world. We are losing species at a dramatic speed, and this is not only linked to climate change, it's also linked to the destruction of habitats in many parts of the world, to the way we have neglected nature in many other aspects. But what is clear for me is that we absolutely need to reconcile humankind with nature. If you look at history, history is full of examples of people fighting each other. I think for the first time, people are fighting the creation. People are fighting Mother Nature. So we need to recognize this, and we need to change course.
Obviously, there are scientists with different views on this, but from what you're being told,
scientists might have different views, but nature is angry. And I've seen it in the Bahamas.
But
when you have more than 200 miles per hour winds that stay in an island for 2 days, destroying everything, Mother Nature is angry. And scientists can say whatever they want, but the overwhelming majority of scientists recognize why Mother Nature is angry. And Mother Nature is angry because we are making it angry with what we are doing, pushing for climate change.
And the Bahamas definitely climate change, in your view?
I mean, we always had hurricanes, but now the hurricanes are more intense, more frequent, and with more devastating consequences. And the reason is simple. As the temperature of the water increases, there is more evaporation. As there is more evaporation, there is more mass of water in the air. Storms become, of course, much more intense than they were in the past.
In terms of this becoming irreversible, what are you being told by the scientists? How long do we have to save the planet?
We don't have much time. We have probably 12 years to change course. If not, it will be irreversible, that we will not be able to contain the increase of temperatures at 1.5 degrees at the end of the century, which means that we will have inevitably much more catastrophic impacts of climate change than the ones that we are now seeing in today's world.
You're a family man, Secretary General. When you think of your children, your grandchildren, and their future, does this issue, the climate crisis, does it keep you up at night?
It's central in my life. I have 3 granddaughters. I have no idea how the world will be when they will have my age. I mean, they are between 5 and 10 years old. So when they will be 70, the world will be completely different. But one thing is clear. My generation has the obligation to allow them to live in a healthy planet. And we are not fulfilling that obligation. We are destroying the planet in which they will have to live.